Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Sirhan on X on this Wednesday night, July the 9th, 2025. Coming to you live from Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States of America. And just hoping everyone in whatever parts of the states and the globe you are in has had a wonderful day today. Gonna get right down to it. Just a really historical day over here because everybody talks about on this day, certain things happen. On this day, certain athletes were born, certain athletes passed, whatever. But here in Cincinnati, it was on this day, maybe the most iconic figure in the city's history was born. It was none other than a fighter known as the Cincinnati Cobra, Ezzard Charles. Now, I've alluded to him on some of my shows in the past, even some of the boxing shows I've done on various channels on the YouTube and the Twitch channels. So I'm going to give this time to him. I've talked about him in bits and pieces, and I'm going to put it together as I commemorate probably the most iconic and probably well-honored sports figure in the city of Cincinnati. You're talking about a fighter who was basically born in Lawrenceville, Georgia, who moved to Cincinnati at an early age and graduated from Woodrow High School out there in the west end of Cincinnati. And basically, as soon as he got out, he embarked on a career in the amateur ranks. Actually started out as of all divisions as a featherweight, something I didn't even know myself. But he moved a massive record of 42-1, and then went on to higher levels to challenge for the Golden Gloves championships, especially here in the city of Cincinnati, where in 1937 he won the bronze medal at the Cincinnati Golden Gloves tournament as a welterweight. But the next 2 years, in 1938 and 1939, Charles would win the gold medal in the Cincinnati Golden Gloves tournaments, which was a big thing over here in Cincinnati, especially in places like the old Cincinnati Gardens and Music Hall, where he would pack the houses back in those days. So that was the amateur career of Ezzard Charles. Also in 1939, he won the Chicago Golden Gloves championship at the gold medal in the middleweight division. And we talking about, winning the AAU titles. He was a national champion at San Francisco at middleweight in 1939, winning the gold there. And in the Ohio District, in 1937, 38, and 39, sweeping the golds in those respective years for the Ohio District AAU titles. Basically, you're talking about a fighter who, one of the more slick fighters who basically had real natural instincts in the ring, natural gifts when it talks about being slick, being able to, the ability to make you miss, make you pay. One of the better counter punchers, sound defensive fighter, very, very knowledgeable in the ring. We always talk about ring IQ. We talk about some of the fighters today. We talk about ring IQ for that time. Few of any had it quite like Ezzard Charles did, and it basically showed in his particular fights. And after the amateur run, he himself embarked on like everybody else, embarked on a career. Started out in the middleweight division, where he basically won his first 20 fights before, his first 17 fights before he lost to Ken Overland in the middleweight division over at the old Crosley Field in Cincinnati. Those here, the local know, yeah, that same Crosley Field that the Cincinnati Reds used to play in. Used to host big time sport events like boxing. And one guy that fought out of there was definitely none other than Ezzard Charles. But that was where he had his first loss to Ken Overland. But he did come back 3 fights later against a standout named Teddy Yarros. They were probably the first big win of his career in the old Music Hall Arena here in Cincinnati. Would go on to win the unanimous decision to beat Yarros. You guys look up Yarros, a tough fighter who always gave honest efforts. A very intriguing story. Charles has handled him rather convincingly on that day in 1941. So after that, he makes his move to the light heavyweight division, where this is where we start to see he really embarked on his own legacy. Basically, the first real test came when he had the 2 fights with the always avoided Charlie Burley. At that time, everybody talks about the most avoided and most ducked fighters in our sport. One guy at that time was certainly Charlie Burley, but Ezzard Charles didn't waste any time. He wanted Burley in the ring, got him in the ring, and beat him twice, and then started his path up on the uprise in the light heavyweight division. About a couple years later, came the stand out with former light heavyweight champion Joey Maxim. You guys know Maxim was one who got a win over Sugar Ray Robinson in extreme conditions. Where the temperature degrees was well over 100, and the heat index flew over that. But Maxim, before all that happened, Ezzard Charles met Joey Maxim at a light heavyweight collision, and in those both particular fights, both unanimous decision wins for Ezzard Charles. And now he starts to make his mark in the division. But in the next fight after the second win, he loses back-to-back to Jimmy Bivens and Lloyd Marshall. But down the line, he would get his vindication on both, getting a split series with Marshall and beating the standout Jimmy Bivens 4 times. And Bivens is considered a top 15 all-time great light heavyweight. And Charles handled Bivens convincingly in the 4 fights afterward. Now, you were going to get wins over fighters like Tommy Hubert and Billy Duncan, among many others. But then came the marquee matchup of May 20th, 1946 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when he met the other fellow standout named Archie Moore. Everybody knows who Archie Moore is. Probably has a claim to the greatest light heavyweight of all time, which I'll touch on that when I talk about the all-time light heavyweights. But in this particular fight, Ezzard Charles had to go to the well because it was a really close competitive fight both ways, but it was Charles going to the well, getting the late knockdown to preserve a unanimous decision win over Archie Moore. And after that fight, the Moore camp cried foul, thinking they should have gotten the decision. It was hotly contested both ways. Could have gone either way from what I've seen, in my opinion. I thought Charles barely eked it out, albeit by a pinch. But it was a pretty darn standout fight between 2 standout light heavyweights. We talk about Ezzard Charles and Archie Moore. Now, after he beat Moore the first time, he would get his vindication in 2 fights over Jimmy Bivens. But that sets up at that time, if you want to call it this, the super fight of Cincinnati and Music Hall Arena, May 5th, 1947, the second showdown between Ezzard Charles and Archie Moore. And the same thing here. Ezzard Charles basically took control of the fight, won this one decisively in his own hometown to get the unanimous decision win, and basically now starts to make the climb up the light heavyweight ranks, because Charles and Moore were fighting for the chance to fight for the World Light Heavyweight Championship. And after that one, he started to begin to make his mark. But 2 fights later, a tough split decision loss to a fellow named Elmer Ray sort of pushed him back a little bit. But he did manage to bounce back to get wins over his revenge win over Lloyd Marshall. And later on, up in Cleveland, it sets up the giant, crazy super fight of the third of that trilogy between Ezzard Charles and Archie Moore. And in this particular fight, Charles just wasted no time and just disposed of Moore in less than 8 rounds to continue his climb up the light heavyweight ranks. And after that, you had a tough fight with a fighter named Sam Baruti, which took place in the old Chicago Stadium in Chicago. Story of this one was not only did he win this fight, but it was after this fight, there was revealed that Baruti died of injury sustained in the fight, maybe in a modern sense, sort of a la what we saw with Jimmy Garcia in his fight with Gabe Arelas. That was what that was at the time. And after that fight, the feeling was he was going to be sort of a different fighter, being Ezzard Charles, because knowing that Baruti had sustained injuries after a fight, you don't know what goes through a fighter's mind when a fighter has that sort of thing happen to him in front of him. We've seen the stories throughout, like mainly Gabe Arelas, Ray Mancini, just to name a couple with their respective fights. But the same thing here with Ezzard Charles. So he basically changed himself a bit of a different way. But he still went on with his career, got his revenge after his loss to Elmer Ray in an 8th round knockout to continue his climb in the same Chicago Stadium. Got 2 more wins over Jimmy Bivens, another one over Joey Maxim. But after being unable to land a shot at the light heavyweight championship, Ezzard Charles now goes to make the move to the heavyweight division. Now, let me remind you, a lot of people talk about his weight in that division. Back then, there was no cruiserweight division. It was the old school 8. It was flyweight, bantamweight, featherweight, lightweight, welterweight, middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight. And basically, by default, Charles is basically a heavyweight on technicality. So this comes after Joe Louis knocks out Jersey Joe Walcott in the second of their two fights. And Joe Louis promptly announces retirement, vacating the championship. So now we have the two guys, Ezzard Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott, fighting for this vacant championship, where both fighters, this was the moment both fighters were waiting for. Because you know about Walcott's story, as he was trying to march his way to heavyweight greatness, Ezzard Charles was looking for a break somehow because he couldn't get one at light heavyweight because the bad business side of it sort of, he felt frozen out. So that's why he made the move to heavyweight. And so here he is on June 22nd, 1949 at Comiskey Park in Chicago, fighting for the vacant heavyweight championship of the world. And in this particular fight, he basically controls Walcott for the most part and gets a unanimous decision win to win a heavyweight championship of the world. And basically hits his pinnacle at that point. In his next fight, he gets a title defense against a fighter named Gus Lasinovich. Lasinovich was a light heavyweight champ Charles was chasing, but couldn't get the title shot in that weight class for various reasons. So they both moved to heavyweight, and this time it's Charles who's a champion, giving Lasinovich a shot at the title. And after round 7, Lasinovich retired in the corner, and it was Charles who got the TKO win. And it was basically at that point, Charles basically looked like he was on the top of the world in the heavyweight division. After a win over Pat Valentino in Valentino's own backyard of San Francisco at the old Cow Palace, 2 fights later, coming out of retirement is none other than the standout Joe Louis. Now, from the Louis perspective, we know why he came out of retirement, because the IRS was on his butt for whatever reason it was. But when we talk about this particular fight, this was a case of Joe Louis, Joe Louis was well past it, and Ezzard Charles, who said one of his aspirations to fight was Joe Louis, one of the guys he admired. So they get into the ring, and basically Charles just whitewashes what was left of Joe Louis at that point, because Joe Louis really shouldn't have been fighting, but because of financial reasons, Louis was forced to come out of retirement. But Charles probably got the biggest win of his career when he got the unanimous decision win in a 15-round decision, albeit probably the biggest name on his resume because of the stature of Joe Louis. So he gets that, makes two successful title defenses, one of them against a fighter named Nick Baroni. When he fought Baroni, he packed the Cincinnati Gardens over here, which is now known as the Cintas Center, packed the house, took care of business, obliterated him in 11 rounds. Got a second win over Jersey Joe Walcott in the second fight after Walcott worked his way back up to the rankings. And again, the 15th round decision win. Got another win over Joey Maxim as another defense of his heavyweight title. But then came the third fight at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where basically he was just beaten, basically just lost convincingly by knockout at the hands of Walcott, where he lost a title in the third of their 4-fight series. But he did manage to work his way back with 3 wins, including another one over Joey Maxim, but lost on a bid to regain the title from Walcott in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on a unanimous decision. So that concluded the Charles Walcott 4-fight series, dead even at 2 fights apiece. But that's what the Charles Walcott series was. You know, they were both fighting for the heavyweight championship after Louis vacated it. Charles won it the first time as it was vacant, got the second win. The third fight, Walcott gets a knockout, and the fourth fight, Walcott gets a decision win. So that was that 4-fight series between Jersey Joe Walcott and Ezzard Charles in the heavyweight division. We talk about some of the better rivalries. That one probably is one of the more underrated ones that doesn't get talked about. You talked about 4 fights. Basically, 2 guys were even matched. Perfect case of styles make fights in both cases when you talk about this 4-fight series with the respective fighters, Charles and Walcott. Now, after a few wins down the line, just to try and get his way up the rankings, after about 7 or 8 more wins, he would finally land another title shot, this time against the standout Rocky Marciano, and the first fight being taking place at Yankee Stadium in New York City. And basically, the story with this one is, first half of the fight, Charles gave Marciano all he can handle and then some, because the first half of the fight, he was basically the state of doing what he could to avoid the power of Rocky Marciano, and did a heck of a good job doing it. Problem was he gradually wore down. The pressure of Marciano took over, and Marciano just worked his way to a 15-round unanimous decision win. The story with this one was during Rocky Marciano's reign as the heavyweight champion, Ezzard Charles was the only fighter during this reign the first of their two fights, to last a 15-round distance with Rocky Marciano at a time when Rocky Marciano was knocking everybody out. And Charles did all he could to survive the second half to last a distance, which he did. Had his moments in the first half, but Marciano just took over and just pounded his way to a unanimous decision win. And that was the first fight. But the first fight was so good, there was a public demand for a rematch. It took place exactly 3 months later on September 17th, 1954, at the same place, Yankee Stadium, the old Yankee Stadium that used to pack the house with guys like Joe Louis and Sugar Ray Robinson, had the rematch between Marciano and Charles. And looked like for a minute, Charles was going to pull this one out when he had Marciano beaten up and cut in the first few rounds of this particular fight. Actually, they called a doctor to look at it to see how bad it was, and he apparently said he contemplated stopping it, but being the champion that Rocky Marciano is, he let it go. So what happens after that? Rocky Marciano turns it up and basically just pounds Charles to a stoppage win in the 8th round to retain his heavyweight championship. And that was probably the last time Ezzard Charles saw any kind of shot at any kind of championship at any level. But you talk about the 2-fight series, Ezzard Charles gave Rocky Marciano all he can handle. First time taking him the distance, the only fighter to do that during Marciano's reign. The second time, it was essentially had his moments, had Marciano cut and hurt at points, but Marciano turned it up. Charles just had no answers. But the age of Ezzard Charles started to show. But it's probably the last time we saw Charles at that particular championship level. Basically, he was split his final 23 fights, going 12-11, with a final record of 95-25-1. And that basically was the end of Ezzard Charles as a standout fighter. One of the premier light heavyweights of the time. Actually, one of the things that made Ezzard Charles a standout in Cincinnati was not just what he did in the ring, but the fact the guy was a promoted civic community education and civic responsibility in the west side of Cincinnati, which is something that's always promoted in that part of town. Anybody who lives out there will tell you this. And that's where he grew up. Basically set up various organizations in the area, and his legacy is honored, and the positive impact that he had on the community still honored and respected to this day. We talk about him being out there promoting education and responsibility, foster a sense of community responsibility, and to promote education throughout his life, which is what he wanted to do on the west side of Cincinnati, which I'll talk about some of the things they did for him out there. We talk about the mural and the road, among many others. Involved himself with many community organizations, which still operates among the many areas in Cincinnati. And every year at the Ezzard Charles Park, which I'll touch on in a second, they have something called Fest to honor him, which gives out free music, free food, and family activities, reflecting the love that Ezzard Charles had for music and his dedication to community gatherings. Then I also remind you, at one point, he also partook in being a jazz musician out here in Cincinnati on the west side. And in the middle of his boxing career, served in World War II. That should tell you about the legacy, the humanitarian, the great Ezzard Charles was here in Cincinnati. I touched on some of the things that happened with him. He has for those in Cincinnati, I'm sure you guys know Ezzard Charles Drive, the road out there out west, named after him. Actually, on that road, about 2 miles east of where the exit is off Interstate 75 out there, is the Ezzard Charles Park. Was named after Ezzard Charles in 2022. They erected a statue after him. It was known as Laurel Park, but Cincinnati Parks voted and unanimously thought to honor the great Ezzard Charles, they would consider naming that park after him, and that's what they did. And there was a statue that was unveiled, and they still have events that go on at that park to honor Ezzard Charles still to this day, to just tell you the impact of Ezzard Charles in the city of Cincinnati. I'll touch on where he stands in Cincinnati sports history in a second. But when we trace back to what I talked about, his stature among some of the great light heavyweights, widely regarded as the greatest of all time. And I would probably have to give him that distinction, not because I'm a homer, because I'll never be one, but just because you look at the peaks of some of these all-time great light heavyweights, Ezzard Charles, Billy Conn, Archie Moore, Bob Foster, Michael Spinks, Tommy Loughran. Harold Johnson, Harry Greb, Gene Tunney, just to name several of them. You could probably argue Billy Conn might have had the greatest peak, and Archie Moore was probably like the, if you want to give maybe ideal comparison, like the Nolan Ryan of boxing at the time, just had a longer career. His career was greatness based on longevity because he got greater as he got older. But Ezzard Charles' peak was probably not somewhere in the middle there. But what maybe made Charles the greatest was probably the fact that not only did he obtain the greatness without getting a title shot, because there are a lot of reasons for it, but he also got the distinction simply because he might have had a longer peak somewhere in the middle between Conn and Moore. Conn could probably have the greatest peak. Charles had a longer peak, but was not far behind it. I mean, you're talking about a guy who basically wiped out the light heavyweight division without even getting a title shot. I mean, that should tell you what Ezzard Charles, his legacy was over here in the Cincinnati and in the light heavyweight division. And of course, always this argument: Ezzard Charles versus Archie Moore. Do you give Moore the distinction because he won the world title light heavyweight that Charles couldn't get, or do you give Charles a distinction because of the greater longevity? Well, let me remind you, Charles handled Moore 3 times, albeit the first fight could have gone either way. The other 2, Charles handled convincingly. And not only that, you're talking about the multiple wins over guys like Jimmy Bivens, who was a standout fighter himself. The 3 over Joey Maxim, who was a light heavyweight champ at one point. The 2 over Charlie Burley, one of the most avoided fighters of that era. Because in the fight game, we always talk about avoided fighters. Charlie Burley, for that time, no one wanted to mess with him for whatever reason. But Ezzard Charles challenged him twice, beat him twice, and beat the standout Tommy Yarrows at middleweight before he ventured into light heavyweight ranks. Got revenge over Elmer Ray, among many others. So the resume is through the roof. And of course, you talk about the 2 wins over Jersey Joe Walcott and winning the heavyweight title. And of course, the win over Joe Louis, even though albeit against a Joe Louis who really shouldn't have been in the ring, but we know why that was. And given Rocky Marciano all he can handle in those 2 fights in 1954, that should tell you the distinct why Ezzard Charles has the distinction he has. And the rated top 15 all time in the I think if I'm correct, I think it was 2003. Ring Magazine had their top 80 fighters of the past 80 years. Charles was ranked in the top 15 in that regard. They had another publication in 2009. I can't remember it, but he was also rated in the top 15 there also. Tells you the honor and the respect that Ezzard Charles gets in the boxing community still many years later. Everyone wants to talk about the modern greats among the all-time great light heavyweights. I get it. But when you can rule the roost the way this guy did and not get a title shot, largely because of many, many reasons I won't discuss on my platform, that should tell you where Ezzard Charles stood. I mean, it's the same way like Sam Langford. Sam Langford didn't get a title shot, and we know the reasons why. You can say it's probably the same for Ezzard Charles. So you can probably put that kind of comparison there. That's why Charles went to heavyweight after Joe Louis retired, because he wanted to win a world title for the city of Cincinnati, and he darn did it when he beat Jersey Joe Walcott the first time. So his place in light heavyweight history, widely regarded the greatest ever. I probably would concur with it. I mean, Billy Conn is up there. Conn might have had the greater peak of the 2, but Charles had a longer peak and basically could have won a heavyweight title. The light heavyweight title had business gone his way and things fell the way they should have with him, but it didn't. We know the reasons why. Archie Moore was like the Nolan Ryan of the division. Basically, greatness through longevity. That's what Archie Moore was. Some would put Moore as the greatest of all time. You know, I remind you, Ezzard Charles handled him 3 times, so that's why Charles likely gets the nod in that distinction over Moore, and understandably so. Harry Greb, Gene Tunney, Michael Spinks, Bob Foster. You throw a Harold Johnson in there, who's another good one. Tommy Loughran was a very darn good one. Throwing a guy like even a Tiger Flowers up there, just among many others. So deep list of the old school 8 in the light heavyweight division. Because when we talk about the old school 8, it's always flyweight, bantamweight, featherweight, lightweight, welterweight, middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight. There was no junior or super divisions. There was no cruiserweight division between the light heavy and heavy. Well, this is well before all of those were established. Let me remind you, in those old school divisions, Barney Ross won a world title, but that division wasn't necessarily recognized. That was what was ongoing when it comes to Barney Ross. But we talk about Ezzard Charles' place in light heavyweight history, probably the GOAT, rightfully so. He's still honored here in Cincinnati every single which way possible. Everything you see on the west side always had the mention of the name Ezzard Charles to it. I mean, the giant mural, if you guys follow me on the X platform, I posted it. I was there last summer when I saw it. For those of you guys in the Cincinnati area who want to see it, it's like a block away from TQL Stadium. You can't miss it. Sucker's like, I want to say at least 800 feet wide by 1,000 feet high. That's how big that mural is that I took a snapshot off of last summer. Of course, the street that's named after him, I mean, it was rightfully so. Just recently, they put the statue and named a park after Ezzard Charles. That should tell you why Ezzard Charles is well loved and well respected in the Cincinnati area, especially on the West End. And we talk about some of the all-time great Cincinnati sports icons. We mentioned him because of that distinction of his and how he's honored still to this day, how he's respected to this day and admired to this day. Ezzard Charles will always top the become number one across the board. Other names we always talk about here in Cincinnati, of course, the stand-up basketball player Oscar Robertson. You know the story with him. The first player to average a triple-double, won an NBA title in Milwaukee with Lou Alcindor, later known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He's a Cincinnati icon. Of course, we talk about boxing. Later on, Aaron Pryor came around. Yeah, Pryor probably had the what could have been career, but packed Riverfront Coliseum and the Cincinnati Gardens himself the same way Ezzard Charles did. Managed to win the World Junior Welterweight title when he just obliterated Antonio Cervantes and had a standout title defense in Cincinnati over a standout Japanese fighter named Akio Kamita. That should tell you about Aaron Pryor's legacy, widely regarded as the greatest junior welterweight of all time. I probably will go along with that distinction with him. So there's Ezzard Charles, Oscar Robertson, and Aaron Pryor. Of course, you think of the history of the Cincinnati Reds in baseball. Johnny Bench, the distinction of the greatest catcher of all time, starting into his career in Cincinnati. Definitely a Cincinnati icon because of it. World Series MVP in 1976. If it wasn't for his play during the 2 years of the Big Red Machine, there's no back-to-back World Series. And his sidekick, the standout shortstop, Joe Morgan. You guys probably know him, the more modern times, as the baseball commentator with John Miller on the old ESPN Sunday Night Baseball when that thing was worth watching. But was a premier shortstop. It was a key piece, along with Bench, during that Big Red Machine of the 1975 and 1976 World Series championships in Cincinnati. And even Johnny Bench said himself after the unfortunate passing of Joe Morgan, we're not going back-to-back without Joe Morgan. Because Joe Morgan was that energizer bunny that sparked that particular 2-year run for the Cincinnati Reds and a loaded lineup that included Bench among many others. So Johnny Bench and Joe Morgan, definitely two Cincinnati sports icons from the Cincinnati Reds. I should add also Barry Larkin. They recently had a street named after him out there. Still contributes to the team. Member of the 1990 World Series winner in Cincinnati, a key piece, the starting shortstop as a rookie, won the National League MVP in 1995. And they have a street named after him, still contributes to the Cincinnati Reds. It was a part of the last time Cincinnati experienced any kind of championship in the city. So Barry Larkin is also up there. You talk about the Cincinnati Bengals, probably the number one on that list. This is a no-brainer. Left tackle Anthony Munoz still contributes to the Cincinnati community the way Ezzard Charles would love to have seen it, and was one of the premier offensive linemen in NFL history, especially that left tackle position. Was never a physical specimen, but what it was more about technique and did a heck of a job at that left tackle position. And he's still a part of the Cincinnati community with his charity work and being a part of some of the Bengals preseason television telecasts, and does a phenomenal job there. And just an all-out standout human being. His legacy here in Cincinnati is always going to be unforgettable because he was a standout himself. He also is a Cincinnati sports icon, the first Cincinnati Bengal to be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And his teammate, the standout quarterback Ken Anderson, like Munoz and among the other icons I mentioned, made an impact over here, was a key piece of when the Bengals went to the Super Bowl in 1981. And like Munoz, Ken Anderson has foundations over here that are just are sensational and just touch the lives of Cincinnati citizens all over the place. And the capper was before he was traded in this past offseason of FC Cincinnati, Luciano Lucho Acosta. It's definitely a Cincinnati sports icon. I mean, I always talk about in my shows about soccer, the passion with the fans and the soccer players and vice versa. Whenever Lucho Acosta was on TQL Stadium's field, he knew how to light up that Cincinnati crowd, and he made FC Cincinnati the talk of the town during his time here. And FC Cincinnati is being successful now. But when Lucho Acosta came over here, and especially the year he won the MVP 2 years ago, he lit up Cincinnati like none other, made that soccer team the talk of the town, and they all just loved him and adored him. And he loved the Cincinnati fans also, and the Cincinnati community, also active in the community, always taking pictures with fans after games and during games. Lucho Acosta is also a Cincinnati sports icon. So we go over list again. Ezzard Charles, Oscar Robertson, Aaron Pryor, Johnny Bench, Joe Morgan, Barry Larkin, Anthony Munoz, Ken Anderson, and Luciano Acosta. Those guys knew how to touch Cincinnati sports like none other. Those are the only acceptable lists I will accept when it comes to Cincinnati icons, because they knew how to do it. They did it the right way, and they accomplished things the way they did it, not just in their professions, but also outside their professions when it comes to charity work and community work. That's why they're Cincinnati icons, and that's why they're spectacular in the city of Cincinnati. And no, don't even put me up there, because I wish I could hold their jock straps, but I can't. I know some of you guys are doing that, but thanks anyway. And that'll wrap up this edition of Sirhan on X. I will be back tomorrow night. And as always, make self-care your number one priority in every walk of life. If you take care of yourself first, all the good things will come your way. If you don't take care of yourself first, nothing else is going to matter in life. Always focus on you first. If you miss any part of this show will be also uploaded live on the audio platforms, iHeartRadio, Apple, and Spotify. You're more than welcome to listen to that there. And I hope everyone has themselves a wonderful rest of the night. Just a wonderful day to always honor the great Ezzard Charles and some of the icons here in Cincinnati, because we've had some great ones over the years. I'd like to see us go back to that again. Will we? Who knows? But until then, have a good rest of the night. Enjoy the evening. Take care of yourselves. God bless. And I'll see you tomorrow.